Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you. Welcome to San Antonio. I'm from San Antonio, so I have the right to welcome you to San Antonio. And I'm really thankful that you're here today. I was walking in, I came in through the hotel, and there were all these people down there with cowboy hats and boots on. I was like, this doesn't look like a transportation conference, even though I know some of you probably wear cowboy hats and boots. But I was like, am I in the wrong place? And then I realized, oh, it's the rodeo. So the rodeo is happening here in San Antonio. If you have a little extra time, feel free to head out to the AT&T Center. It's a very exciting place and interesting to walk around there. And certainly I'm assuming there are tickets left, but if there aren't, you can just walk through all of the barns and so on and look at the animals. So today I'm going to be talking to you about largely the census, but certainly demographics and the population. And one thing that I do know is that without people, you don't really have a need for transportation. You don't have a need for roads, you don't have a need for cars, you don't have a need for trucks that are moving goods and goods around the state. So population is a very key element of understanding what our transportation demands are. And so when we look at population change here in the state, you can see that between 2000 and 2019, we added approaching 4 million Texans. That, if you look at that, it adds up to almost 20% of the population change in the country. So we're accounting for about roughly approaching a fifth of the population change in the country. And so thinking back what I was just talking about, population and transportation, you can certainly see that we have very significant needs in this state in terms of transportation. And I'm sure that comes as no surprise to any of you. If you look at population change in the state, and you look at it on a daily basis, so here we're kind of looking at the most recent year we have data for, but if you break that into what we refer to as the components of population change, first of all, you can see that we add about 1,000 new Texans every day. But of those 1,000 Texans, about half of them, or a little bit less than half of them last year, were babies. So there were just more children being born than people dying, and so we're adding babies. But if you can also see that about 34% of our population change was from domestic migration. That's people moving from other states to Texas, and that is one of the things that puts tremendous demand on our infrastructure. Population growth from you're not creating new households, you're not putting immediately new cars on the road, but when you have people moving from other states, they're coming in with their family, they need a new housing unit, they need water, they need electricity, and they're going to have a car or two that they're going to put on the road. They're also going to need services and various kinds of goods from retail, and they're working for companies that are producing stuff that are moving goods as well. So growth from domestic migration really drives a lot of our demand and need for transportation. Whoop, went one too far. This is just showing you that same thing over the decade. So you can see that roughly over the decade, about half of our population changes from natural increase, more births than deaths. And it varies in terms of how much of it is from domestic migration and international migration. And largely that varies as a function of fluctuations in our economy in Texas, because domestic migration is largely being driven by employment opportunity. People are moving here to work. Oh, went one too far too. I should probably stop clicking because I think somebody's clicking back there. This is just showing you how our population has changed so far this decade. If you look here, the lighter blue columns are population estimates going up to 2019, and the darker blue columns are the Texas Demographic Center's population projections. We're projecting that we're going to be a little bit under 30 million Texans at the next census. And if you look at the trends that the Census Bureau has put out in terms of their population estimates, they're a little bit lower than our projections are. But nonetheless, we're really going to be close to 30 million Texans at the next census. And as you saw earlier, we're growing more than any other state, and we're growing faster than other states. So if we look at population distribution in the state, we have what we refer to as a population triangle, and that's the Dallas-Fort Worth area, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston are the points of that. And if we look at that and look at all the metro areas within that area, within the triangle, that's about 70% of the population. If we were to draw a line along I-35 and count the population along I-35 and all of the population east of it, it's about 87% of the population, and 13% west of I-35. Another key thing, which is somewhat related to the metro areas, 70% in the population triangle, is really 90% of our population is in urbanized areas. So we're not like this rural Texas that we used to be. We're very much an urbanized state. One of the things that we're actually currently doing right now, the Texas Demographic Center is doing, is trying to estimate how urbanized areas have changed in the state over the decade, because that definitely has an influence in terms of funding and how funding is distributed. This is showing you population change at the county level, numeric change projected up to 2020. And you can see that we have tremendous growth in some of the urban cores. I mean, many of these areas adding more than 100,000 people over the decade. But then we also have a lot of counties that have lost population. So you kind of see all those red counties have lost population. A lot of young people there aging up through high school, look around, where are they going to work, where are they going to go to school? They end up moving to the urbanized areas. That helps contribute to the growth in the urban areas of the state. Another piece of this is there's an aging population there, and as people retire, they want to go be where their kids are, be closer to health care, so they're moving into the more urbanized areas as well. So we really have some challenges in terms of, and certainly have very significant dichotomy in terms of urban and rural in terms of the population dynamics. This is just showing you percent change, and you can see percent change is an indicator of how fast the population is changing. You can certainly see that the population triangle areas, the counties around the points there, are growing significantly. But look at the Permian Basin area. Just tremendous growth there. And certainly very significant transportation needs are happening as a result of that. Here's showing you population trends this decade by race and ethnicity. The top line is non-Hispanic white. The second line down are Latinos. The next line down, African American, then Asian, and then everybody else. One of the things you can see here is that the Latino population is almost at parity with the non-Hispanic white population in the state. If you kind of carry this forward, they'll be at parity in 2021, 2022, sometime around that point. Also, we have a very significant growing Asian population in the state as well, even though you can't, it looks like it's a small, it is a small percentage, but it's growing very quickly. When we look at population change this decade, you can see almost 84% of the population change in the state is from growth of minority populations. So they're growing, the minority population is really driving the growth in the state. And that has to do with both the natural increase component, so more births than deaths, but it also has to do with domestic and international migration. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the census. In fact, I'll probably talk a fair amount about it, because that's probably one of the most significant demographic events, at least for demographers. We get all excited about the census because it only happens once every 10 years. So it actually has a lot of impact on us in a range of ways. So one of them is reapportionment. So we're looking at Texas getting an additional 3 U.S. congressional seats after the census. And so that's the first thing that happens is the census data are delivered to the president, and those data at the end of this year of 2020, and that will define how many congressional seats we get. It also determines how many electoral college votes we get. It also then is used for redistricting, and that's kind of always a fun thing to spectator sport to watch as a whole redistricting process. But all kinds of districts are drawn based on the census data. So certainly there's the US congressional seats, the Texas Senate and House seats, but school districts, city council, I mean, you could kind of go on and on. All of those districts use census data to redraw themselves. And then the distribution of resources, federal resources, dollars that we give to the federal government that come back to the state, are also determined by, at least in part, by the population size, and that's a very significant thing. There are estimates that a 1% undercount in Texas would cost us about $300 million per year. You know what our undercount was in the 2010 census? About 1%. So essentially, Texas has not been receiving its fair share of federal tax dollars in return as a function of an undercount of the population. So the census is getting ready to happen. Starting March 12th, the census is going to be mailing all kinds of things out. It's going to be different this time than it ever has been because you can use your phone, you can use your computer, you can call to complete the census. And when you'll get a form and it'll have information on there about calling or getting online. And so you can do that. The census is intending to have most of us respond using the internet or the telephone. The census is underfunded, so they're trying to save money, and this is one very significant financial saving if they don't have to send people out to every housing unit. They also then will send out a mailer with a form, so you can actually do it by paper and mail it back. That's more expensive than internet or telephone. And then eventually they'll start sending out enumerators to knock on doors. And I've kind of listed a number of other steps here as well that they'll go through. So the Census Bureau is actually trying to be as smart as they can in terms of conducting the census. If you look here, they have pretty good information about the characteristics of the population down at the census tract level, and they have strategies for distribution. So what I was just talking about earlier sounded like everybody's going to get the same thing. They actually have very micro geographic focus in terms of their strategy for trying to get a return. And so they've identified areas where, like rural areas, they're not going to be mailing stuff because a lot of people have post office boxes. They're in a rural route, and so they're actually, the enumerator is going to go and knock on doors and leave forms and that kind of thing. And then there's a whole range of other things in terms of language and so on that the Census Bureau is going to employ. So there are hard to count populations. And in Texas, this kind of is highlighting those hard to count populations. Largely, it's a function of estimating this is looking at how people respond to surveys and to the last census. And so when we look at that, certainly you look at the lower Rio Grande Valley, and actually all along the Rio Grande, there's challenges there. But if you look at some of the urbanized areas, and I'll talk a little bit more about this here, this is looking, so that was looking at hard to count populations. This is predicting response. And you can see that, again, that it looks very similar to the previous map, but if you zoom in, you can kind of look at the urbanized areas. Let's see, there's Austin, San Antonio on the left top, the right is Houston, top right is Houston, lower Rio Grande Valley, and then the Dallas-Fort Worth area bottom left. There are little pockets within our urbanized areas that have populations that are hard to count. And again, the Census Bureau is working very hard to try to ensure that those populations are not undercounted. And one of the things they're doing is they're engaging with complete count committees. And probably if you're from an urbanized area, there is a complete count committee in your area. There are all kinds of subcommittees in these complete count committees dealing with educational institutions, government, school, educational, hospitals, healthcare. So there's a whole range of things, and certainly I would encourage you, if you're not aware of that, to kind of become aware of the complete count committees in your area and become engaged there. There's the state in Texas has not putting any resources toward advancing a complete count, financial resources. That's not unusual. More than half of the states in the country are not putting any resources into supporting a complete count. However, our Secretary of State has convened state agencies, including TxDOT, and I was on a call, I think it was last week. It's amazing what all of our state agencies are actually doing to try to promote awareness about complete count, and I'm fairly confident that TxDOT will be doing some things as well. But there's also a private sector organization, the Texas Counts, and they have subcommittees all around the state, subcommittees and connections all around the state. There's a private sector community foundations that have put a pooled fund together to support efforts at the local level to promote the census. And so certainly if you're interested in being engaged in this, you can get on to the TexasCounts.org website and learn more about that. The last thing I'm going to talk about here is something that is probably of more concern for transportation planners going forward. It has to do with the fact that a lot of really smart data people have figured out how to take tabular data and identify individuals within those data. And that's a problem because the Census Bureau, by law, has to protect the identity of individuals for all of the data that they receive. So once it comes behind their firewall, it's locked down. They can't release individual level data about individuals, households, businesses, and so on. They can only release it in a way that's non-identifiable. And so smart data people have, like, if you went and got a large credit card database, there's ways that you can actually, algorithms they figured out and they've proved that you can actually identify individuals in a table, aggregate table, and that then has caused the Census Bureau to realize they have to essentially make the data harder to identify. In fact, their goal is to make it close to impossible for anybody to identify anybody. So they're infusing noise in it. And so as they do that, if you kind of look at it's probably hard to see this thing on the left there, but the idea is that as you infuse more noise, then the data quality go down. And as you infuse more noise, the privacy goes up. And so the challenge for them is to figure out where this is. And the Census Bureau released some data with the 2010, well, we have the 2010 census data as they were released. And we have the data that have noise infused in it. And this is just, these two tables here are just showing you there's a pretty significant difference when you get to small geographies. So people that are trying to plan with transportation analysis zones, it's going to create some challenges for us going forward. So the last thing, I was just listening to Mark Davis, and he was like, well, it doesn't make any difference if you have an undercount in terms of how much money Texas gets. I think there probably makes a difference in terms of how those resources are distributed and where they go in terms of transportation planning. But there are significant resources that come to the state from the federal government, and that makes sense given that we're the second largest state and we're growing more than any other state. So we have some real challenges there in terms of planning. And we would have challenges if we have an undercount. We're likely to have some challenges as this noise gets infused into the data. So that said, I have been very impressed across the state in terms of how people are engaged in the census. It's a very important thing. It's part of our democracy. It's written into the Constitution. Participating is safe and secure, and it's important. So I certainly would encourage all of you to do anything you can to encourage well, first of all, complete the census, and then second of all, encourage everybody you know to complete it as well. So let me stop there. This is our website. You're welcome to go there and get access to a range of information, presentations, and so on. And so there we go. Thank you.